Isaac Asimov's Foundation series is considered one of the greatest science fiction series ever written. First written 80 years ago, starting with some short stories published in Astounding Science Fiction magazine, they were later combined and published as novels. The Foundation series consists of 7 books total, but it is the trilogy first written in 1942 that is considered the original series. This trilogy was then later expanded upon with additional books, including multiple prequels and multiple sequels. In this video, I'm going to talk about the Foundation trilogy only, reviewing them, and giving my opinion on whether or not they stand the test of time, and whether they're worth your time to read. The Foundation trilogy consists of Foundation, Foundation and the Empire, and Second Foundation. I'm not going to talk about any spoilers in this video, so if you haven't read these books yet, don't worry about being spoiled. I'm only going to talk broadly about the story, but I'm not going to get into any specifics. Let's start off discussing the first book in the trilogy, Foundation. Now, honestly, I didn't really want to start this video discussing this book first, even though, it makes the most sense to start with this book since it is the first one in the trilogy. But I didn't want to start the video with this book because, honestly, I didn't really like it that much. And I don't want the first part of this video to just be me complaining when there are so many great things to talk about, especially in the later books. So I'm not just going to complain about this book because, even though I didn't really care for it, there are some aspects that I did like. But before I get into the specifics about what I didn't like versus what I did like, let's first discuss the overall story. The story follows Hari Seldon as he establishes the Foundation. He does this because he knows that the Empire ruling the galaxy is going to fall and that humanity will enter a dark age for approximately 30,000 years after that fall. At this point, it is already too late to save the Empire from falling, but by establishing the Foundation, he can minimize the impact and limit the Dark Ages to come to be just about 1,000 years instead of 30,000 years. And he knows all of this essentially because of math. This math is called psychohistory, and using this he can tell what is going to happen in the future as well as how to alter the future. Now, the Foundation is established on a distant planet on the edge of the galaxy, and at first the Foundation is just tasked with collecting all human knowledge and putting it into an encyclopedia. But later, the task is to grow beyond their single planet and establish their power over their corner of the galaxy. And throughout this book, we see how the Foundation grows and matures after facing different obstacles that threaten to break down what has been built. And that pretty much sums up the story in this book, so let's discuss the things about this book that I didn't really like. The book starts off fascinating, with a great setting and story being built up. But then it skips ahead 50 years, and you have an all-new story to care about and all new characters to care about. And then, again, many years pass, and then you have a whole nother set of characters and a whole new story, and then this just keeps happening in this book over and over again. So really, this is a collection of short stories, not a single chronological story. And maybe if I knew that when I first got into this book, it wouldn't have bothered me as much as it did. But every time I started to get invested in the characters and what was happening, the book skipped ahead. And really, the best thing I can say about this is that at least with each section within the book, it has its own closure that is tied up pretty neatly. And this makes it possible to cover a lot of time early on with the history of the Foundation in such a short book. Another aspect of this book that I didn't really like was the fact that so many of the characters are forgettable. And again, this is probably just due to the fact that we only spend 50 pages with them before the story skips ahead. But I would have preferred some more fleshed out characters so I can feel more invested in them and their struggles. And then another thing about this book is that it is pretty old. It was published in 1942 originally, so some of the stuff in it does not seem very futuristic. So for example, the Foundation is establishing an encyclopedia to hold all human knowledge. Kind of sounds a little bit like the internet, doesn't it? Although, I guess it is different since the internet is not a single device that holds all of the information, which the Foundation is. But still, it is things like that that you kind of have to ignore, because at points, it can sound a little quaint. And those are just some of the things that bothered me with this book, but a good thing that I can say is that the setting and the overall story is absolutely fascinating. And by overall story, I mean the establishing of the Foundation to minimize humanity's Dark Age period. That is really what kept me reading through to the end of this book. So that's great and all, having a good setting and a good story overall is important, obviously, but when the characters and the short stories within do not really keep you invested all the way through to the end, it is kind of hard to care. And one more thing worth bringing up is how there's not a single female character in this entire story. Seriously, like, I'm not exaggerating at all. You have plenty of significant and insignificant characters in this book, but not one of them is a female. It makes it seem like women play no role at all in this universe, and this is really odd because when you read modern books, for example, there is equal representation of women and men pretty much all the time. So when there's no representation of women in this book at all, it can definitely be a little jarring. And remember to keep this point in mind as we move on to the next books in the trilogy as well. So like I said, I didn't really enjoy this first book, and actually I was close to not reading the sequels because after this one, I didn't have much interest. But I am really glad that I didn't give up because the second book is absolutely fascinating. Foundation and Empire. I really, really like this book. It is a huge improvement over the first book in pretty much every single way. But first I get into the specifics about why I like this book so much, let me just kind of give you a quick overview of the story, and again, no spoilers, I'm going to keep it pretty broad. Unlike the first book, which was multiple short stories in one novel, this book is separated into two parts. Part 1 follows the Empire as it's trying to find the Foundation. It has now been approximately 200 years since Hari Seldon established the Foundation, and when the Empire discovers or rediscovers them, they see the Foundation as a threat to their supreme rule over the galaxy, which, by this point in the story, has already started to deteriorate. The Empire, and more specifically this general for the Empire that's seeking both glory and power, he attempts to destroy the Foundation. And without getting into specifics about what happens, the Foundation does survive this and lives on to flourish and expand their reach across the galaxy. The second part of this book is about this mysterious being called the Mule. The Mule is the biggest threat the Foundation has ever crossed and could lead to the downfall of the Foundation. The Mule is able to conquer people and planets seemingly easily, but nobody knows who the Mule is or how he's able to do this so easily. And again, I'm not going to get into any specifics with who the Mule is or what happens to the Foundation, because in my opinion, the best part of this book is the mystery around all of this. And what's interesting is this book actually reads a little bit more like a mystery novel. Throughout the book, you're trying to figure out what the real purpose is for the Foundation, and who the Mule is, and how he's able to easily conquer a planet so easily. It's really fascinating. Oh, and then the twist at the end of the book, oh, absolutely fantastic. It makes everything that happened before make perfect sense. I really, really, really loved it. I can't express that enough. So, obviously, that's all good stuff, right? But is there anything that I didn't really enjoy about this book? Well, the only negative I can say about this book is that the first part is definitely not as interesting as the second part. In fact, a lot of the story beats and the characters in the first part of the book, I don't really remember that well. So it definitely was not very memorable for me, but I think this is mainly due to the second part overshadowing the first part. And like I said with the first book, which suffered from having no women represented in the story, this was still an issue in the first part of this book, where the first part did not have any significant female characters. However, I am glad to say that the second part of this book does actually have a strong female character who is, without delving into spoilers, very important to the story and actually impacts where the story goes. So yes, this book was absolutely great, and the way it ends perfectly to lead into the final book in the trilogy, Second Foundation. So right off the top, I'm going to say Second Foundation is an absolutely great book. It's definitely a lot better than the first book in this series, but probably not quite as good as the second book, in my opinion. Before delving into the specifics of what I liked and didn't like about this book, first I'm going to give a quick overview of the story. And again, there's not going to be any spoilers, and really this time I need to be very careful with what I say, because a non-spoiler for this book could still be a spoiler for one of the earlier books in the series. So this is going to be a very quick, very light overview of this book. Just like Foundation and Empire, this book is separated into two parts instead of a collection of short stories like the first Foundation book is. Part 1 of this book continues the story of the Mule from Foundation and Empire, and it follows the Mule as he searches for the second Foundation, which we, as the reader, are not sure whether it exists or not. And I'm not going to get into any specifics because I don't want to spoil anything, but what I will say is that the closure to the Mule's story arc is both satisfying and really unexpected. Part 2 of this book follows many years later after the Mule, and follows the Foundation, and more specifically a group within the Foundation, that are trying to find this mystical second Foundation. I really like how this part of the book focuses more on normal people of the Foundation than on, leaders and emperors and generals that came before. Specifically, a young girl whose actions turn out to have an absolutely massive impact on the story and the Foundation overall. And this is also the first time in the trilogy that the story has focused on a character that's not an adult, so that was also kind of a nice change of pace as well. Again, I won't spoil anything, but I will say that part 2 ends with a surprise that I did not see coming at all, and the closure you get at the end of this book is perfect for the trilogy. So yeah, I thought this book was absolutely fantastic. Not as good as the second book, but definitely still great and way better than the first book. I love the closure we got with the Mule, and it really helped define him as a great character in the trilogy. Arguably one of the best, most in-depth characters in the entire trilogy. Unfortunately, that also makes it plainly clear how a lot of the other characters around the Mule are far less interesting and shallow in comparison. The second part of this book was also really great. The only thing I didn't really like about it, though, was reading through it, there are parts that seem kind of irrelevant until you get to the end, and then you realize every little thing that happened was all part of a master plan. Reading through this again would probably be absolutely fascinating, but as a first-time read, I was definitely, scratching my head at points, being like, okay, why do I care? So if you are reading this book for the first time, make sure you pay attention to all of the details, even the small ones that seem irrelevant. And again, with this book, we see more equal representation in the story, but it is definitely far from perfect. It does slowly improve, though. We still do not get to see any female characters in a position of power, but at the very least, you can see how female characters impact the story throughout the book. I guess that shows something. So yeah, Second Foundation is another great book in the trilogy, and it definitely kept me hooked all the way through, and the ending to this book wraps up the story beats and finishes off the trilogy perfectly. So watching this, you might have noticed that I didn't really talk all that much about characters in these books, other than Hari Seldon, the Mule, and some little girl. And the reason for this is because most of the characters are honestly pretty shallow and forgettable, unfortunately. And that is something I've noticed in other Isaac Asimov books that I've read. He writes these totally captivating stories in these richly detailed worlds, but his characters are never a match for the quality of his stories and his settings. And a lot of the time they are forgettable, and it is hard to care about them. Sure, this is not true with all of the characters in the trilogy. There are definitely some fascinating characters that you will truly end up caring about, but unfortunately there are more characters that come off as shallow and forgettable, and that is probably the biggest negative I can say about these books. If you read books to get invested in characters and the life they live and the struggles they encounter and the relationships they develop, this trilogy might disappoint you to some extent. But since everything else about these books is really great, and if you can get through the first book, not that it's terrible, it's not a terrible book, it's still a fine book, you will find that these books deserve to be classics in the science fiction genre. Another thing to keep in mind, the Foundation series is not a bombastic space opera saga with battles and action set pieces, although there are certainly some battles, and some very tense moments in these books that honestly kind of had me at the edge of my seat at times. This series is more of a political intrigue with mysteries and a bunch of math to all wrap it up in. I mean, no, not really. Hari Seldon's master plan in establishing the Foundation was based on his math, psychohistory, but it's not like this plays an important role in the story at all. So, don't worry about being inundated with a bunch of math reading these books. After reading these books, it's no surprise to me that these are considered Asimov's best series, along with his robot series, and the fact that these books are considered classics in the science fiction genre is also totally well-deserved, in my opinion. The only other thing I will say is that I really don't have any interest in reading more Foundation books beyond these three. And that is not a dig at these books at all, but rather the fact that the story is so well contained and concluded in these stories. I really don't see a need to go beyond this. Of course, if you disagree with that, please let me know in the comments below. So, to answer the big question, does the Foundation series hold up well in our current day? I can say that, yes, it absolutely does. Sure, I mean, they're not perfect by any means, and if you are able to overlook some aspects that come off as a little old-fashioned, like the embarrassing representation of women and the fact that some of the futuristic technology seems kind of quaint in today's image, this is an amazing trilogy that I think any fan of science fiction should read. Also, I want to be clear that I'm not alluding to the fact that I think Isaac Asimov was a misogynist at all. You have to think about the time period when he wrote this book. Back in the 1940s, there were essentially no women in positions of power. So it's no wonder that in these books, women are not represented well. Not that that makes it okay, of course. It certainly wasn't very forward-thinking of Asimov, which is, kind of what science fiction is supposed to be all about. But that definitely is still a point to keep in mind when reading these books. And that pretty much sums it up. Let me know if you have any questions or comments down below, and I'll see you guys very soon. Thanks for watching.